Hello and welcome to Rank and File Radio Prairie Edition on CKUW 95.9 FM, Canadian labour news and analysis across Manitoba, Saskatchewan and Alberta. This show is an independent partner with RankandFile.ca and supported by CKUW listeners, Patreon supporters, and UFCW Local 832. This episode is broadcasting from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Today's broadcast date is April 21st, 2019. I'm your host, Emily Leedham. Today on the show, fighting back in Jason Kenney's Alberta. We'll talk to Chloe Rockarts, labor organizer based in Edmonton, and Emma Jackson, an organizer with Climate Justice Edmonton, about how we can start to build solidarity, networks, resources, and capacity to fight back against impending public service cuts and privatization, and put forward a vision of a just transition, including unionized, well-paid, green jobs for workers in Alberta and across Canada. But first, a quick news update. The Saskatoon co-op strike has ended after 5.5 months, with 54% of UFCW 1,400 members voting to accept the co-op's latest offer. The union went on strike to protest a two-tier wage system that would see new hires earn less. After months with no progress, the union put forward a modified version of the two-tier system that reduced the wage gap between tiers and allowed workers to transfer from one tier to the next. The union also gained a 14% wage increase for all workers. The strike may be over, but it has instigated a larger battle over the co-op itself. Members of the co-op organized many solidarity rallies and actions throughout the last 5.5 months, and have tried to effect change at the board level to facilitate better treatment of workers. On Thursday, April 18th, the group Co-op Members for Fairness selected candidates to run for the board positions at the Co-op AGM in June. You can find more information in the show notes. On April 16th, 2019, Jason Kenney, leader of the United Conservative Party, was elected as Premier of Alberta with a majority government, winning 63 of 87 seats. The incumbent NDP party, led by Rachel Notley, held on to 24 seats. Voter turnout was a record 71%. Jason Kenney has promised a summer of repeal to undo most of the NDP's policy changes, including eliminating the carbon tax, introducing a youth minimum wage at $13, and repealing recently updated labor laws. He has also promised to balance the budget and lower taxes, requiring massive cuts to public sector services and eliminating public sector jobs. Also on his agenda, a $30 million war room to, quote, counter lies and misinformation against the oil and gas industry, which will no doubt involve attacks on Indigenous resistance, climate activists, and journalists. Before the election, I co-wrote an article with Chloe Rockarts, a labor organizer and reporter for RankandFile.ca, exploring how public sector unions were preparing for a potential Jason Kenney election. This article is called The Past, Present, and Future of Workers' Power in Alberta. We talked to Guy Smith, president of the Alberta Union of Public Employees, Greg Jeffrey, president of the Alberta Teachers Association, and Mike Parker of the Health Sciences Association of Alberta. We also reached out to the United Nurses of Alberta and the Canadian Union of Public Employees, but both unions declined to participate. In this article, we asked labor leaders several questions. We asked them to reflect on how public sector unions fought back under Alberta Premier Ralph Klein's austerity in the 90s and early 2000s. We asked what labor relations were like under the NDP, and we asked what political organizing and education initiatives their unions had done to address racism and white supremacy in Alberta. And finally, we asked what kinds of conversations and organizing these unions were doing in anticipation of a potential Kenney government. In my interview with Chloe today, we talked about what we learned through writing this article and how these conversations can inform strategies to fight back against Jason Kenney. This show is called Rank and File Radio for a reason. We believe that worker power should be built from the bottom up, among rank and file members. We don't have to wait for union brass to give us the green light to organize, build solidarity, and fight back. But unions have massive resources available for organizing, outreach, and education, and so it's relevant for union members to understand and be invested in how their dues are or are not being used. Unions also have vast institutional memory and networks with labor organizers across Canada, and it is important for rank and file members to be able to tap into that wealth of knowledge and build capacity. Living in Jason Kenney's Alberta will be overwhelming for many. Speaking for myself, living in Manitoba under Conservative Premier Brian Pallister, and knowing many folks involved in the fight back against Doug Ford in Ontario and Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, this fight will require serious effort. Strikes, mass mobilizations, walkouts, and other strategies will be crucial. If you've never organized or participated in a direct action or mobilization, this prospect can seem overwhelming. What will be important during this time is finding or creating a community and developing an analysis of what is happening in the province, in your city and community, and where you can effectively intervene. Start small. Who are your networks? Where do you work? Go to school? Where is your place of worship? Find a group of 3 or 4 people you trust and commit to doing one political action a month. Show up to a rally, go to a workshop or reading group, get involved in your union. Develop practical organizing skills like collecting emails of people in your community, creating a database, and maintaining a mailing list to let people know what community events are available. Host an art build to create signs and banners. After each event or action, debrief with each other about what you learned. Seek out resources from organizers who have more experience. There may be groups or initiatives you can already plug into, but in many cases you may need to start your own. If you are part of a union, getting people to show up to meetings may be challenging. Developing that infrastructure to build real community, solidarity, and effectively mobilize people must be seen as a long-term project. Organizing is something anyone can do with practice, but it does take perseverance. Part of our goal here at Rank and File Radio and RankandFile.ca is to help connect workers to each other, build those solidarity networks, share knowledge, and help workers develop a coherent analysis of the labor movement in Canada. Our editors and writers are based across Canada. We've reported on many labor battles, both victories and losses. If you are a writer or worker involved in labor organizing, we want to hear from you and help share your struggles with other workers. We also would love to help connect you with resources to help inform and strengthen your fights. Visit RankandFile.ca and contact us with any questions. And on that note, sincere thanks to those who have recently donated to the Rank and File Radio Patreon. I have now hit my goal of $250 per month and will now create one extra episode on a labor history subject per month. As a news show, I like to focus on what struggles are happening right now, but it's also helpful to be able to dive into history sometimes and see what lessons we can pull out of it for today. And with that, we'll get into my interview with Chloe Rockarts about our article, The Past, Present, and Future of Worker Power in Alberta. Chloe Rockarts is a young worker, organizer, and writer for RankandFile.ca. She recently moved from Ontario to Edmonton, Alberta, where she is developing labor education and programming for LGBT youth.
So, to me, labor organizing matters for a number of reasons. Primarily, the most obvious answer to this is that collective action works, and you can't have successful collective action without doing any form of organizing. And in specifically talking about union organizing, which is something that I've done a bit of, I would say that unions to me historically have obviously had the capacity to change a lot of policy, to make things better, and to provide actual enforcement for labor policy, whether it's around the minimum wage, around health and safety, and all the things that we have gained today because of that. And I would say mostly organizing matters because it allows us to build consciousness among workers, and have that collective consciousness be able to actually result in progressive changes. I think for a lot of folks involved in labor organizing, there's a fundamental understanding that individual workers can't make a difference, and when workers are organized, they can actually have the power and build the power to have conversations about what needs to happen in order to get economic justice, essentially.
So we wrote this article where we talked to some public sector labor leaders in Alberta about their thoughts on building worker capacity, on doing this kind of organizing. What was the most interesting or surprising thing you learned through the conversations that you had?
I think there were two kind of major things. As someone who comes from Ontario, I really didn't have a good grasp when we started of Alberta's labor history. Kind of the only thing that I knew about Alberta before I moved here was that it was very conservative and it had the lowest union density in the province. So getting a chance to hear a bit about the resistance that happened in labor during the Klein era, I think was the more interesting aspect for me. And I think particularly what the Alberta Teachers Association, the ATA, said around the 17,000 people coming out to protest education cuts during that time was a kind of important piece of resistance that I think will be useful moving forward, and learning about what unions did under Klein and how a lot of them were very honest with the fact that they weren't prepared, I think is a big lesson that hopefully labor leaders will be taking into this new kind of UCP, Jason Kenney era. And I think the other thing that was really refreshing was the honesty that a lot of the organizations had about the fact that they haven't been doing enough to really work on building kind of a understanding of racism and doing work to challenge white supremacy within the unions itself. I was very surprised that multiple labor leaders were so open with the fact that they hadn't done enough and that they want to be doing more.
Totally, yeah. We talked about anti-racism within the labor movement, and like you said, everyone agreed they could be doing more political education on the issue. Do you know of any examples of what that might look like, maybe from your experience in Ontario or other places?
Yeah, this is, I think, a really fundamental question to the future of unions and the future of labor. I would say that people often forget that. And I think not only do people often forget, but they consciously make the choice to forget and often don't bring it up, that the labor movement in North America was kind of built on a politics of exclusion. Labor, and you and I have talked about this, like multiple people in our circles talk about this, the fact that labor is still very white. It's still primarily male run, and there seems to be little, well, there have been a lot of gains made, it's not enough. And so I think in remembering that history and like openly saying that history, we need to recognize that the labor movement isn't doing enough to challenge racism within their own membership, let alone externally. But in terms of examples, I don't know too much about this personally, but I have heard about it in the past month. The Alberta Teachers Association has a program called Walking Together, Education for Reconciliation, and it is a project that is fundamentally about incorporating Indigenous history and cultures and languages and essentially doing work towards decolonization in the education system. In terms of things from Ontario, I would say I recently went to a talk with someone from the CBTU, which is the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. And those folks are doing incredible work to challenge white supremacy in the labor movement itself, but also in the community. The workshop that I went to was about specifically environmental racism and the role that labor has to play in like doing environmental work that is fundamentally about challenging white supremacy and decolonizing. And then I would just say, I think the 15 and Fairness movement in Ontario is a very good example of organizing across race, across faith groups, and really doing the political education work that is necessary to build a movement that has seen a great deal of success, despite not actually achieving 15 after Ford was elected.
Yeah, definitely. That's one thing that I've been really interested in seeing is people starting to organize around $15 minimum wage in Alberta. I think were some students who did a rally recently, which was really cool. It's great that the NDP implemented the $15 minimum wage, but of course Kenney is going to attack that. He's going to attack low-wage workers, and to have a network there that is ready to fight back, as opposed to having to just build it up from scratch like right now. I think that's really valuable thing that we saw in Ontario. They had a network and a base that was ready to push back the moment that Ford started attacking. Whereas in Alberta, I think a lot of that groundwork still has to be built up. So I thought that was interesting. What is the number one lesson you think Alberta's workers should learn from Ontario's fight back against Doug Ford?
Absolutely. I think you just said it. I think because of movements like the 15 in Fairness movement, because of folks working on migrant justice in Ontario, there has been a lot of capacity building that has come out really outside of the traditional union movement. I think the Ontario Labour Movement has launched this kind of rapid response network, which is essentially like an organizing fly squad that can take part in solidarity actions around whatever Ford is doing. And I think developing something like that here is really necessary. I'll admit that I'm still very new to the province, so kind of scoping out like who is organizing, what kind of exists already, and who's been doing the work for decades before the NDP was elected, what kind of organizing work was happening while the NDP was in office, and what are those organizations' plans moving forward. So I would say developing a response network and developing really, I think, what needs to happen, including in Ontario, but especially here, is developing the capacity of organizers. I think your comment about the 15 in Fairness movement and the students that organized those actions here, the lesson is, follow young workers and follow students. Students have always been at the forefront of movements, and we saw that in Ontario earlier this month with the massive protests around education cuts. So I think really tapping into young folks that are really upset about this UCP victory, really want to make tangible movement on talking about things like climate change. That's what we need to learn. And I think that's happening in Ontario, and that's happening in lots of places across the country. But I haven't really developed a good analysis of what is going on in Alberta's labor movement and what is needed.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts. Do you have any final thoughts or comments that we didn't get to talk about?
The one thing that I would say is that a lot of the unions that we spoke with for this piece, while they acknowledged that they hadn't been ready before, that they weren't ready for Klein, they framed it as, we are ready now, we're the public sector unions and we're ready to fight Kenney if he comes at us. And I think the reality that people know is that he will be coming after unions, and he will be coming after the public sector specifically. For me, one of the most difficult things about moving forward is seeing the number of seats that Kenney got. 63 is a lot. And to me, that really, really indicates that Labour hasn't been doing enough and isn't ready. Because if their own membership are voting against their self-interest because they haven't been politically oriented in a careful and intentional way, then I think there is a great deal of work to do. And I think that needs to be work that isn't just about mobilizing their membership to attend rallies, but is about fundamentally a political education program that is really, like I said, intentional about explaining this is how you will be affected. This is what your work is going to look like under this new government. And a lot of folks know that and realize that, but I think there is, in all unions, but I see this in Alberta, that Labour leaders specifically aren't doing enough to really deeply engage with their membership and have these difficult conversations. And I think also that the movement needs to be built outside of unions. And when I say that, I don't really mean like we need a mass coalition of all of these social movements coming together to fight. I do think like some of that is necessary, but I don't think a mass coalition is an effective strategy often. But I think that unions need to be developing their own capacity while at the same time funding different forms of organizing. So that really, really includes, and you and I have talked about this, listening to young people, especially when those young people aren't unionized. There are a lot of workers in this province that don't have access to unions and maybe never will. And labor leaders need to be able to hear that criticism and not get defensive and not immediately look to protect their own membership or their own positions, but take responsibility for learning how to genuinely communicate with workers and with the rank and file and really do the work, because we're going to be needing it in the next 4 years. And I think the final thing that I'll say is that unions really need to start organizing outside this 4-year electoral system. It's not enough, and it's never been enough, and we need to, if people are going to call for a general strike, I think that's all good and great, but what's the actual work being done to make that possible? I don't see it right now, but would love to be a part of creating that momentum.
That was Chloe Rockarts, young worker, organizer, and writer for RankandFile.ca, based in Edmonton, Alberta. You can find the article we wrote together, The Past, Present, and Future of Worker Power in Alberta, on RankandFile.ca. Emma Jackson is a settler on Treaty 6 territory, where she's an organizer and activist with Climate Justice Edmonton. So Jason Kenney has said that he's going to create a $30 million war room to counter lies and misinformation about the oil industry. What is this going to look like, and who is he going to go after?
Yeah, I think for us it's still really unclear. He hasn't provided that much clarity about exactly what that looks like. He just sort of says, yeah, it's to stop lies and misinformation from, these like well-funded, foreign-funded radicals. And ultimately in Alberta, what we see is that a lot of the people that are really resisting pipelines and that are standing up against expanding the oil sands and fossil fuel infrastructure are like disproportionately Indigenous peoples and like a handful of environmentalists across the province, and I think increasingly so a lot of young people. I think the way that, or what we're sort of anticipating as climate justice organizers and are looking into more, is the possibility of things like slap suits, trying to in any way crack down on any flow of money sort of coming into the province in whatever shape or form that looks like. For instance, you might have seen that Michael Buchart months ago wrote a really great article in Briar Patch about the fact that in a lot of ways this is taking straight out of the playbook of like Netanyahu and the way that he's cracked down on pro-Palestinian activists. And so definitely I think that there are ways for us to start to look deeper into what this could be, but ultimately it's going to be like an incredible waste of taxpayer dollars ultimately, because we can tell you right now that it's like you're going to find a bunch of young people who just care about the state of the planet and are like painting banners all the time.
So what is Climate Justice Edmonton doing in anticipation of this to fight back?
I mean, I think ultimately it's not directly changing in any way what we've been doing all along. I think if anything, what we've seen since Kenney's been elected is just in the past few days, so many people reaching out and wanting to support us. So one thing that we have done is we released a GoFundMe page basically to say, the opposite is really true. And that is what is like so appalling about this entire framing, is that to imply that a bunch of young people are the ones who are foreign funded instead of this massive multi-billion-dollar industry that is corporate executives and corporations, international corporations that are, completely controlling a lot of our political system. And so we've released a GoFundMe in order to raise money to support our own organizing efforts, and also to direct much of that funding out to local Indigenous groups and local sort of frontline organizing that's happening across Alberta. But I think for us, it's really about just like, here's this incredible opportunity and moment in order to channel people's rage and people who are looking to resist Kenney And if anything, I think that the sort of opposite intention that he would hope would come from, all of this rhetoric is happening, where we're seeing so much more support and so many more people who want to get much more involved than they ever have been before.
Recently, the president of the Alberta Federation of Labour, Gil McGowan, tweeted before the election, "Jason Kenney is a gift to people who want to stop construction of pipelines to the coast." You and a few other young organizers, including myself, took him to task for this comment, and he blocked us. So how can we overcome the idea that climate justice and preserving jobs are diametrically opposed?
First, I would start off by saying that I think what is also just so infuriating about those comments, and what led me to respond in the way that I did, is that ultimately what you're doing is you're alienating an entire group of people who are ultimately to some extent on your side in terms of wanting to resist Kenney, wanting to protect workers, wanting to ensure that we're addressing climate change. And to imply that Jason Kenney is a gift to us is just so infuriating, when young people are the ones who are going to be disproportionately affected by a lot of his policies. In terms of the question about how do we ensure that people realize that climate and jobs are not diametrically opposed, what I would say is we have seen over the past 4 years and longer that what is happening to the oil economy right now is not about not being able to build a pipeline. It is about the fact that a transition is happening. A boom is never going to come back to Alberta in the way that it has in the past. And so what is needed now more than ever is for us to get on the front end of what a transition would look like and start to shape how that can kind of be in the interest of workers and communities. I think that one of the biggest things was saying that jobs and the climate are not diametrically opposed is there are no jobs on a dead planet, and ultimately we're going to be left with a ghost province in a matter of decades if we do not respond to the climate crisis and the scale of action that it demands. And I think there's so many opportunities here, especially to think about how we can transform our economy into one that is powered by 100% renewable energy. There's so many channels and ways that we can not only retrain workers, but also just shift the existing skills that they have into new jobs. And so another thing that I think is really great, and that I would love to see the Alberta Federation of Labour talking about, is we have billions of dollars in oil liabilities from wells across the province. And it's we should be putting thousands of workers back to work in cleaning up those wells and in now retooling our economy for the transition that needs to happen.
And so what is Our Time, this campaign that launched just last week?
Yeah, so Our Time is a campaign that has been launched by young leaders across the country in partnership with 350.org. And what we're doing is, in the lead up to the federal election in October, we're mobilizing thousands of young people across the country to really shift the Overton window. And so really pushing what is seen as politically possible in this country when it comes to action on climate change and when it comes to action on Indigenous rights. What we've seen, I think, with the Liberal government and what is currently happening is we're constantly in this place where it is as if massive government intervention on climate is not even something that gets talked about and doesn't have any traction. And so what we need is a base of people, and we need to be pulling in thousands of people in order to shift that narrative and to demand just a complete transformation of our economy in a way that taxes the rich and ensures good jobs for everyone and is grounded in Indigenous rights and massively expands racial and economic justice. And so what you'll be seeing with Our Time is young people across the country who are showing up to hold political candidates accountable and to ensure that they have to pick a side. And so you're either with us or you are with fossil fuel billionaires and their political allies like Justin Trudeau, like Andrew Scheer. And so for once, it is about saying you need to have a plan that is actually in line with the scale of the crisis right now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking time to share a bit of the organizing that you've been doing. Do you have any kind of final thoughts or comments that we didn't get to talk about?
I think the final thing that I would say is I would really actively encourage people to, check out our time, check out just existing organizing efforts that are happening in your community. I think that the election of Jason Kenney is just such a clear indication right now that these, centrist, lackluster policies are not what is going to be actively encouraging people and motivating them, and that it's going to continue to sow division. And so what we need to do is being really engaged and pulling in as many people as possible, and that's a great way to get started.
That was Emma Jackson, organizer with Climate Justice Edmonton. To find more information, you can visit climatejusticeedmonton.com. You've been listening to Rank and File Radio Prairie Edition on CKUW 95.9 FM, Canadian labour news and analysis across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. This show is supported by CKUW listeners, UCW Local 832, and Patreon supporters like Alexander, Angela, and Wasim. Thanks for keeping the show going. Subscribe to Rank and File Radio on iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Stitcher. And don't forget to check out RankandFile.ca for labour news and analysis across Canada. This is Emily signing off. I'll see you next week.